Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Dungeons of Tonisborg ASMR, where we explore this wonderful product, the Lost Dungeons of Tonisborg. We've gone over the history of the dungeon, then we have a huge section on DM's tips, and then we have the actual dungeon. So I thought we'd explore the actual dungeon, maybe even do a live play through the actual dungeon. But while exploring the first level, it comes up with the question that it sort of addresses something we've already been talking about the past couple of days: randomly generated adventures. Does a classic year one randomly generated dungeon stand up to today? And can you create a randomly generated dungeon that makes sense? So we're looking at the first level of Tonisborg. And we know the first level of Tonisborg is controlled by an organization called the Order Dracone. They're a knightly order that was originally created to prevent and protect people from whatever inside the dungeon getting out, and to patrol the dungeon and deal with whatever is hiding in there. But of course, as all things, after a few many years, maybe they've not as knightly as they used to be. All right, so the very first level, we have dungeon level number 1. That's the level that's supposed to be under control of the Order Dracona. So a lot of these will just be encounters with normal dudes who aren't enemies, which makes you wonder, why are they in here? So room 1, level 1, is 3 magic users and 3 fighters who are in the employ of the Order Dracone, but they have secret plans to plumb the depth of the dungeon and grow in power. And then we have the stat blocks for these 3 wizards and these fighters, and the treasure that they might have. Now, the very next room, which is within walking distance of this room, if you look at the map, contains 5 wraiths. 5 wraiths. So, are these wraiths in there as weapons for the priest to use? Are they trapped there because the priest trapped them there because they don't know what to do with them? Or are they just there because for some reason in a 10 by 10 room, 5 wraiths are hanging out for reasons? And if there are 5 wraiths, how come the priests and the wizards haven't dealt with them? Because in room 3, we have 10 priests, including 1 level 4 and 1 level 3. These are all members of the Order Draconon. Those priests should be powerful enough to deal with the wraiths if their job is to protect and control the dungeon. So this brings up the question of, can you make a randomly generated dungeon make sense? Now, in the old days, classic D&D, murder hoboing, kick open the door, kill the monsters, take the treasure, wouldn't mean that much. It's like, it's just randomly generated, that's what you run in. But now, today, you start questioning these things. And I think I know I questioned stuff like this even back then when I was a kid. I can't be the only one. So, how do you make this make sense when you have 2 rooms, each within walking distance of that room, containing individuals who could easily destroy the wraiths, unless they're using the wraiths as, guards, as weapons, or perhaps the wraiths are the dead bodies of former knights. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense. No, location number 4 is just got a pool in it, shallow pool. So this is where the knights get their drinking water and stuff. And there's some giant frogs hanging in here. Now, this one has 20 giant frogs hanging in here. Now, if you look at the map for room 4, it is a 1, 5, 10, 20, 10, 20, 30, 30 by 20 room. So, sure, yeah, I could see 20 giant toads hanging out in there. Now, you remember that a giant toad is probably the size of a dinner plate. I think the largest frog known, is like under about a pound. The popcorn frogs, I believe they're called, the really big ones. But then we move on to location 1, number 5, room 5, and they are 12 goblins. 12 goblins hanging out in room 5. 12 goblins hanging out in a 10, 20 by 20 room. Sure, I could see 12 goblins easily hanging out in a 20 by 20 room. They're supposed to be guarding a hidden room, which I guess is room. I don't see the hidden room. It says they're guarding the hidden room, and they've made themselves at home. So are these goblins working with the Order Draconin, or if they've come up on their own? Who's told them to guard this room? In room 1.6, we have gnolls, who are hiding out in a secret treasure. And it specifically says, what are they doing here? So obviously they're not supposed to be here, unless they're secretly working with the knights because the knights have gone bad and are planning to do something. But otherwise, we've got two gnolls who are guarding a huge chunk of treasure. So perhaps they're the ones that hired the 12 goblins to guard the hidden room, which is room 6. And room 6 is... I don't see room 6. Oh, it's all the way over here. Yes, this is a secret room. So the goblins are not guarding that room because they're on the opposite side. And room 6 is room 6 is big enough for two gnolls. And room 7 is another room with water in it. Again, more giant toads. Perfectly fine with that. Room 8 is just appears to be a room where they're storing stuff. It's got some giant rats in there. It's got some bits of cloth. So basically, it was a storeroom that's gotten inhabited by rats, and for some reason, they haven't dealt with them yet. Room 9 is spiders. Spiders who are feeding off the rats. So there's two rooms that actually feed off of each other, except, of course, they're probably nowhere near each other. So room 8 and room 9. Actually, they are near each other. Okay, so that works, especially if what's his room 10. And then room 10, his snakes. So I can see the snakes eating the giant rats, or I can see the spiders eating the giant rats. But having 3 rooms where one is rats, one is spiders, one is snakes, plus you have supposedly these knights whose job it is to patrol, you'd think they would have had those under control by now. But it appears that in typical classic D&D thought pattern, those guys never leave the room. Room 11 is empty. Room 12 is empty. Room 13 contains a bunch of giant centipedes. And room 13 is a 15 by 15 room. So sure, I can see, but how did they get there? Why are the order allowing these insect infestation in the level that they're supposed to be controlling? Level 14. Level 15, room 15 is a torture chamber. So it appears that the Order of Draconia has begun to slip away from their nightly duties as they've created a torture chamber where they torture the monsters that they capture. And there's some torturers in here. Okay, so that would explain the story of maybe the slow corruption of the knights being corrupted by the dungeon, and maybe why they're letting the dungeon fall apart, the level they're supposed to be controlling, because, now they're turning from good and knightly and pure to maybe not so good. Then we have a bunch of kobolds in room 16. 21 kobolds. 21 kobolds. Now, room 16 is pretty big, so I could see some 21 kobolds living in there. But why are they just living in there? Shouldn't they be wandering around? They're not even on the random wandering muncher table. So, what is this troop of kobolds doing in here? How'd they get here? Then room 17 is a study, which is infested with giant ants and has a whole bunch of treasure in there. Now, what is a giant, including 4,000 gold pieces? What is a giant ant doing with 4,000 gold pieces? And room 17 is a 10, 20, 30, 30 by 20 teeny little room. More of an alcove, really. So we've got 12 giant rats. Each rat the largest ant is about an inch. Those are the African ants, those huge African ants. So sure, I guess, but what are they doing with that? And how'd they get in here? So they're just living in the bookshelves, it looks like. Room 18 is a bedroom, but now it is inhabited by 18 giant weasels. 18 giant weasels. So these are all things I changed to try and make it more sense. Make some more sense. 1, 2, 3. It's a secret bedroom with 18 giant weasels in it. Now, normal weasels about the size of a house cat or a rat, depending on what type of weasel it is. But they can get pretty big. And we have a laboratory, which is haunted by 18 ghouls. Room 19 is 18 ghouls in a 10 by 10 room. There's no way 18 human-sized individuals could fit in this room. But okay, sure. And they're guarding 500 gold pieces. Room 20 is a chapel, part of the lair of the priests, even though the priests are in room 3. Room 20 is right across from room 3, so that makes sense. But it's right next to room 21, which has more priest stuff. And then room 22, which has got more giant ants. Now, you'd think the priest would notice that there are giant ants in his, his room, his temple. But apparently he hasn't noticed yet. And then room 23 is a dungeon cell where they have imprisoned a prisoner. Room 23 is a 10 by 10, 20 by, 10 by, pretty big room. So I guess this priest is keeping this guy prisoner. So some of this fits, and some of it is just random ones. So again, that brings back the question, can you make a randomly generated dungeon make sense? If I were to make a randomly made dungeon, once I've established the theme of, say, Tonisborg or Godhome or whatever a dungeon I would build, and you just roll on the random tables and you get 51 fighters, and the room randomly generated is 10 by 10 room. Do you bother to explain how 51 fighters could fit in a 10 by 10 room? Or you just say, yeah, magic. And why are there undead in a level that is controlled by priests, unless those priests have turned dark and are now using the undead as part of their corruption, or have been corrupted by the undead? And that's the story you're telling. And the only thing that makes sense is the room with the giant rats and the snakes, because the snakes are feeding off the giant rats. Other than that, we've got a couple rooms that fit the story of a knightly order who might not be as knightly as they're supposed to be, and maybe that's one of the stories, is you have to discover the secret of the knightly order of Tonisborg being slowly corrupted and why. And then we just have the typical Dungeons and Dragons random rooms. Here's 18 goblins. Here's 6 gnolls. Here's 4 giant ants that are guarding, that for some reason have 4,000 gold pieces. Because I guess they mistook the gold pieces for leaves. And then they brought them back to the anthill, and then they're like, oh, dude, Charlie, those aren't leaves. Those are gold coins. We can't eat those. And the other ant's like, oh, dude, but my eyes, man. I got to get ant glasses. And the other ants are like, what are we going to do with 4,000 gold coins? We can't eat these. We can't use them to, I guess we can make walls inside the ant nest out of them, I suppose. And the ant queen's like, I can't eat these. What are these gold things? Unless those opened up and there's chocolate inside, why did you bring 4,000? How do we even fit them in there here? So that's where the randomness. But even though by our silly, sensical standards of, well, should a dungeon make sense? I think a dungeon should make sense. Even a randomly generated dungeon should have some sense to it. That's why I like the idea of Borrow Maze. Although once I played through Borrow Maze, I felt it was a boring slog. But see, there's potentials for stories in here. You could tell if you just padded them up and maybe removed some of the things that don't make sense and replaced them. Because now I can see that there's a story of the corruption of the priests and why they're letting these things come up and, whatever. So that's Level 1 of the Lost Dungeons of Tonisborg. Do you want to hear me continue to go through Tonisborg on our Friday Tonisborg ASMR? Do you never want to hear me do this again? Would you like to do maybe we could make a character and do a solo play? Do you think we should design a random dungeon of our own for September, October? I don't know. Reading this dungeon gets you start thinking about dungeons. Now, I can't draw dungeons, but I can come up with ideas for them. Somebody else wants to make the maps. That's where it is. Hopefully you appreciate this ASMR, and thanks again for the people behind this and the people over at the Secret History of Blackmore who allowed us to take a look at this important document from the early years of our beloved Dungeons & Dragons. I've been your ASMR host, the OGGM. Please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Look at that. I managed to use my radio voice almost throughout the whole thing. I'll talk to you soon. Drive careful out there. It's raining.